Hello everybody and welcome back for another edition of Ukraine This Week with me, Don Arleth. This week we saw another attempt at peace talks in Abu Dhabi, a temporary ceasefire on energy infrastructure that didn't live up to expectations, a prisoner exchange bringing home 150 soldiers and 7 civilians, many of whom fought in the siege of Mariupol, and Starlink access for Russian forces has finally been blocked, creating havoc for Russian communications in occupied territories. On another front, we're starting to get a clearer picture of the colossal losses suffered by the Russians for minimal gains. A report from the Center for Strategic and International Studies shows Russia taking 1.2 million casualties, up to 325 of them fatalities on the battlefield. We'll break down the conclusions of Russia's grinding losses in Ukraine with one of the authors of the report, Seth Jones. But before we do that, let's see this report from Ukraine this week. Despite negotiations, the war continues with no sign of de-escalation. During the second round of talks in Abu Dhabi, Russia kept striking civilian infrastructure, primarily targeting energy facilities, leaving hundreds of thousands of households without power in extreme winter conditions, with temperatures dropping to minus 20 degrees Celsius. Moreover, those major attacks on Ukraine came during a so-called energy ceasefire, a personal request by U.S. President Donald Trump to Russian President Vladimir Putin. The ceasefire was supposed to last for 1 week, however, it only lasted a couple of days. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky called the move disgraceful and a blow to U.S. peace efforts.
We need to get through the winter, and we need appropriate weapons for air defense, appropriate missiles. Our colleagues from Poland have written all of this down. And if this is possible, we are ready to exchange them for modern drones.
And it appears that Russia is not deterred from striking Ukraine even during the visit of NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte to the capital, where he saw damage from the attacks with his own eyes.
But this is not even a military thing. This is hitting innocent civilians. So I take this extremely seriously.
Another prominent figure that visited Ukraine this week was Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, who announced a new aid package for Ukraine worth more than 47 million euros. Kyiv and Warsaw have expressed willingness to swap Ukraine-manufactured drones for Polish MiG-29 fighter jets. However, President Zelensky indicated that Kyiv currently prioritizes other air defense capabilities to protect energy infrastructure and cities.
This Russian strike truly violates what was agreed upon by the American side, and there must be consequences for this.
The Polish Prime Minister has left Zelensky's request unanswered, saying he needs until Monday to consult Polish officials. And with those hardships already, there are fears Ukraine may face greater national ones, including potential territorial concessions. U.S. brokered talks in Abu Dhabi between Russia and Ukraine have rekindled negotiations as the full-scale invasion approaches its 4th-year anniversary. While no breakthrough has been announced on territorial issues, Russia still maintains its maximalist demands. The only progress that has emerged was highlighted by U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff.
Delegations from the United States, Ukraine, and Russia agreed to exchange 314 prisoners, the first such exchange in 5 months. While significant work remains, steps like this demonstrate that sustained diplomatic engagement is delivering tangible results and advancing efforts to end the war in Ukraine.
Meanwhile, the frontline situation remains tense. Russia continues to attack and capture more territory, hitting a market in Druskivka in the Donetsk region with cluster munitions and dropping bombs on the town, killing at least 7 people. Russians are also facing new problems as Starlink terminals, which Moscow relies on to guide drones and coordinate attacks, have been deactivated, according to Ukrainian officials and military observers close to the Kremlin.
For the enemy on the fronts, it's not just a problem, it's a catastrophe. All command of the troops has collapsed. On many sections, assault operations have been halted.
Under an agreement between Elon Musk's SpaceX and Ukraine's Ministry of Defense, all Starlink terminals are blocked by default unless manually registered and verified. Musk said the problem was fixed, and Ukraine continues to implement the registrations, creating a whitelist of Starlink terminals that are authorized to function on the territory of Ukraine. Some soldiers and units have reported outages due to the registration requirements. The largest conflict on European soil since World War II continues at an enormous cost. A late January report by Seth Jones and Riley McCabe of the Center for Strategic and International Studies underscores the staggering price a world power is paying for minimal gains. Since February of 2022, Russian forces are estimated to have suffered 1.2 million casualties, including up to 325,000 killed, much of that in the past 2 years, in exchange for roughly 1.5% of Ukrainian territory. Ukraine, meanwhile, has incurred an estimated 500,000 to 600,000 casualties with up to 140,000 fatalities. This war of attrition has become a strategic disaster for Russia, whose losses now exceed those of all its post-World War II conflicts combined. And now joining me to discuss the enormous price Russia paid in its war of aggression, including casualties, fatalities, and a strain on its economy, is Seth Jones, President of Defense and Security Department at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Hello, Seth. Thank you so much for joining us on Ukraine this week.
Thanks for having me.
Yes. Now, breaking down this report, for you, what were the most striking figures you discovered while compiling your research?
I think what was most striking were both the numbers themselves, so particularly on the Russian side. So our estimate of Russian casualties at reaching 1.2 million by the end of December of 2025, that is between February 2022 and December of 2025. The fatality rates that are casualties, by the way, being killed, wounded, and missing, and then killed numbers being upwards of 325,000. What's particularly interesting from a historical perspective is how large those numbers are. They're more than any major power has suffered in any war since World War II, and the number of fatalities, for example, are 5 times larger than what the Russians and Soviets suffered combined between World War II and the beginning of the full-scale invasion. So that magnitude of what the Russians are suffering on the ground, I think, was in many ways surprising.
Yes, and I saw your figures, and I think we might even have a graph on it, and it shows the progress of this, right? So in 22, you had about 100,000 casualties. Then it exploded, doubled that, and around 250,000, and then it blows up to upward of 400,000, and that is what, 24 and 25. I mean, this is amazing. I was in Ukraine in 22 and 23, and we thought we were seeing significant losses, especially in Bakhmut, the meat grinder that was turning out there. But actually, the most deadly or most damaging years were 24 and 25. And you also highlighted in this report that they only received or took about 1.5% of Ukrainian territory during that time. So what does this kind of signify overall about this great power, the world's second largest military, the Russians?
Yeah, the Russians are really struggling. There's no question about it. One of the other data points that is also interesting is if we look at average rates of advance, some of the most brutal offensive campaigns over the last century have been in some wars like World War I, World War II. Battle of the Somme, for example, that brutal campaign, the British and French forces were only moving about 80 meters on average per day. The Russians in the Chasiv Yar axis have been down to 15 meters per day, Kupiansk 23 meters per day, even Pokrovsk about 70 meters. These are among the slowest we've seen on any major campaign in any war over the last century. So I think what it means is, the Russian military is so incredibly underperforming on so many different categories and losing soldiers, amputees, those killed at such a high rate that it is, it has definitely taken a toll on the Russian military.
Certainly. Now, do you think that this may signal, I've heard some analysts say that this really just shows us that Russia is already defeated in Ukraine?
I don't think it suggests that Russia is defeated. I think there are a couple of things that are worth noting. One is, I think President Putin has indicated throughout this war by his actions, he hasn't necessarily said this bluntly, but that he is willing to shed Russian blood for this war. You can see that the vast majority of those killed and wounded are not coming from important political cities for him, like St. Petersburg or Moscow. They're coming from the Far East. They're coming from the North Caucasus, areas that are expendable for him. So as long as he's not losing sons of elite in some of the major politically important areas, I think he's willing to continue in many ways. It is also worth noting that there are signs of some strain on the Ukrainian side. They're getting short of air defense systems. They're short of tactical drones on the front lines. So, the Ukrainians are struggling in some areas too.
Yes, and manpower. And then we have recent reports indicating, 200,000 soldiers gone AWOL. How much more do you think Russia is willing to endure, and how much more do you think that Ukraine can take under the current circumstances of support?
Well, it's an interesting question to try to get in the mind of the Kremlin on how much more it can take. I think the key question for Kremlin leaders, including Vladimir Putin, is looking forward. What's the time horizon look like? I think if they have an indication that the U.S., for example, is going to wind down its military support for Ukraine, its intelligence support, any future training, that it's not going to impose either additional sanctions, it could even be secondary sanctions, that may give an incentive to Putin to continue to fight, because I think he may assess that the opposition and the Western support, particularly U.S. support, may be weakening. I think on the other hand, if he sees something different, increased aid, sanctions that hurt his economy, which is struggling dramatically right now, and we looked at a range of those indicators, he may feel differently. So I think part of the question is sort of what's the U.S. going to do over the next couple of months, if anything. I think that would affect his judgment call.
Yes, and in the report you call Russia a second or third-rate economic power, yet the West has poured hundreds of billions into the defense of Ukraine. How is it that such a weak economic power can continue to wage such a brutal and costly war?
Well, what Russia has done is basically hollowed out its productivity. It is pouring its money into its military-industrial complex, and it's been aided significantly by the Chinese. We looked at Chinese aid, what we call high priority items, things like machine tools, microchips and computer chips, radar, sensors that the Chinese have provided. So that has allowed the Russians to continue to operate, and their economy is not collapsed. I think what I would say, though, is the economy is really hollowed out. You don't see much foreign investment in Russia. Nobody wants to take that step. And then just basic productivity like technology. Russia doesn't even have a single company in the top 100 technology companies in the world. A lot of European countries, Chinese, Taiwan in there. Russia's got zero. It's ranked at the bottom of almost every artificial intelligence indicator that we looked at, including one from Stanford University. So it is falling further and further behind on productivity for really the short-term military campaign.
And, something that hasn't been discussed very much lately, but, we know Russia came into this war with all of these vast stockpiles of Soviet-era weapons, tanks, artillery, what have you. Do you think that that threat that it once posed, that conventional threat to Europe, has been severely diminished. To what extent are we looking at with Russia in terms of its conventional capabilities posing a threat to, say, Europe in the future?
Well, I would answer that in two ways, and they're sort of interesting sides of the coin. The first is, the Russian military has proved on the ground in Ukraine after 4 years that it is not an effective conventional force. It cannot do combined arms particularly well. It can't do fire and maneuver, can't do joint operations particularly effectively, and it has struggled in Ukraine, for example, to bring together air and ground forces, or ground and naval forces together, to take territory quickly in what we call maneuver. And so it's forced to do attrition. Nevertheless, I would say two things. One is the Kremlin assesses that the high body counts are largely caused by the West, the Europeans, US, and others. I think Vladimir Putin will remember that as long as he is alive on this planet. He will blame the high bloodshed on Europe. I think he will want revenge. And second, as long as the Russians get assistance from the North Koreans, some from the Iranians, and most importantly, the Chinese, their industrial base, I think they will be able to reconstitute their military over time, and especially if there's a pause in the fighting. So I actually think the threat from Russia over the midterm is likely to be more severe because of the casualty toll, the unprecedented casualty toll that the Russians have suffered since World War II. I think they'll be looking for revenge.
Yes, and the Russians have learned a lot in this war. They've adapted. They've watched the Ukrainians be ingenious with their tactics and adapting the drone technologies and what have you. And the Russians have been playing catch up and keeping up quite well. What do you think the Western partners should do right now to turn the tide? More military support, more sanctions, both? What are Russia's main vulnerabilities at this stage?
I think Russia's got two major vulnerabilities. They both lead to pretty straightforward recommendations. The first is some of the economic challenges that I mentioned earlier that Russia has. It does have oil and gas to export, particularly oil. But I think increased sanctions on the Russian economy would be a big problem for Vladimir Putin. And that also includes more effective action against the shadow fleet. So Russia's series of vessels, for example, that are illegally exporting goods, including oil, from Russian territory. And we have seen some effective European efforts, including some recent French efforts against Russian vessels or other flagged vessels that are transporting Russian goods. The second is, I think, increasing aid to military assistance to Ukraine. Ukraine needs air defense systems, but it also needs long-range strike capabilities so that it can target Russia's military-industrial complex. And then it also needs tactical drones to increase targeting of Russian soldiers trying to push through. Those are a couple of examples, in addition to training, intelligence, and other things that I think would really continue. The Russians are suffering about 35,000 casualties per month. If that goes up to 40, 45,000, that starts to have an impact.
Yes, and finally, you and Briley McCabe also compiled estimates of Ukrainian losses, something that has been very difficult to determine since 2022. What are they? How did you come to these numbers? And why are they different from the 55,000 that only was announced by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky?
Yeah. So with Ukrainian casualties and killed, in any war, frankly, this is as much true on the Ukrainian as the Russian side. There are a lot of incentives not to provide accurate information. Both countries are under states of emergency right now, and these are imprecise. In my time in the U.S. government, when we did assessments of this, for example, the Taliban in Afghanistan, they were generally ranges. So what we did is we looked at essentially all estimates of Ukrainian and Russian casualties and fatalities, including as much data sets as we could get our hands on, names and names of individuals, locations. We also talked to a range of Polish, U.S., British, Finland, and other intelligence and government services about their estimates. And we came up with roughly in the neighborhood of 500,000 to 600,000 Ukrainian casualties since the war began, and somewhere around 100,000 or a little more fatalities between February 2022 and December 2025. So we're looking at a range. Is it 100% accurate? No, but I think we feel pretty comfortable based on our interviews with European and U.S. government agencies that we're probably in the ballpark. I think what is important to highlight is that the ratio of Ukrainian casualties and fatalities is somewhere in the neighborhood of 2.5 or so Russian casualties to every one Ukrainian. So the Russians are taking much bigger losses. They have more manpower and more that they could mobilize, but they are taking significantly higher losses right now.
Well, it certainly is the worst conflict we've seen since World War II. Seth Jones, President, Defense and Security Department at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thank you for doing this report, and thank you for sharing all this information with us here on Ukraine This Week. Very much appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Honored to be on.
And now, joining me to discuss the second round of peace talks in Abu Dhabi is Marina Miron, researcher at the Defense Studies Department at King's College London. Hello, and thank you so much for joining us once again here on Ukraine This Week.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, now we've heard of no breakthroughs yet. We hear it was constructive there in Abu Dhabi, but what humps do you think it is that still can't be overcome there?
What we have to understand is that there are points that the Russian side is not going to negotiate, and those points concern the territory. And it is understandable that the Ukrainian side is also not going to cede those points to the Russians, because the Ukrainian side is saying it is our territory, some 20% of the Donbass that the Russians haven't taken. And Ukraine is saying we're not going to withdraw our troops from these parts of the Donbass, because for the Ukrainian side, it is very important to maintain the defensive line, the Donbass line, the so-called Donbass line, which includes cities such as Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. And therefore, this is one point where the Ukrainian side is not going to give in. Besides, President Zelensky has talked about the fact that the constitution cannot be changed. Those territories are Ukrainian. But what we have to understand, and one Ukrainian official who has been participating in the talks said that it is important. We have seen that military leadership has been talking, or at least the intelligence, military intelligence, the head of military intelligence from the Russian side and also from the Ukrainian side. So the militaries are talking. And it is important to create some sort of a background before a political decision is reached, because you have to agree on how do you divide this up? What do both militaries do? What steps need to be taken? So from that perspective, it has been important. And of course, we have a bonus of exchange of prisoners of war, but we have seen that before, and I wouldn't really classify it as a tangible result. However, a lot is going on behind closed doors. And of course, it is important for both the Ukrainian and the Russian and also the US side to not leak any details of these meetings to the media. However, we know that for sure the point about the territory remains a significant obstacle to any sort of agreement between the two sides.
Now, Looking at this situation, of course, you know it better than most. Are there any solutions that nobody is talking about right now? Is there any conceivable something, when we hear about Donald Trump saying, good negotiations are that neither side is happy, yeah? So if we can put ourselves in that box, is there something we can kind of look at that might be outside the norm that could be a potential solution to be talking about?
I guess that's $1 million question, and I'm sure I would be involved in the peace process if I had an answer to that. But that being said, what is important to understand here is that Ukraine is in a precarious situation economically, and it is dependent on the Europeans and on the US. Therefore, what the Trump administration is trying to do is to find some sort of a middle ground. And I like the way that it was phrased some 8-9 months ago, that both sides will have to give something up in order for this to work. And therefore, it is important to find some sort of incentives which would satisfy both the Russians and the Ukrainians, while finding ground for compromise on both sides. Let's take, for example, the peacekeeping force of the coalition of the willing. For the Russians, it is a no-go. So it would be possible to look at a different composition of such force, which would also satisfy the Russian interests. Countries that are friendly to the Russians could be represented in such a force, and you could deploy this force on both sides of the line in order to make sure that the ceasefire is working. The problem here is, of course, we have ceasefire on the one hand, that is one proposal that is being discussed, and the other proposal is peace. And it is important to distinguish between the two, because ceasefires often get violated. And if you look at military history, they have only made wars much worse. So there has to be a stable background in order to make sure that this ceasefire implemented as part of a peace deal, not separately, is working. And of course, we have to also listen to the demands that the Russian side is presenting, aside from the territory, such as Russian language and so on and so forth, and see if we can get that to work in, to say, well, some of your demands, let's say 50% of your demands, have been satisfied. Ukraine is getting this, but therefore Ukraine is getting, let's say, EU membership. Problem here is the EU itself is not sure that they are ready to accept Ukraine, because there are other countries waiting for membership, and therefore there are many legal problems. So you need to first agree on a possible scenario with other actors. Let's say the United States would reach an agreement regarding Ukrainian membership or speedy access to the European Union in exchange for something else. In exchange, say, for the US offering more military support or whatever it might be. You also have to talk to countries that are involved, not directly, but that have been known to supply both sides, such as China's big players, and try to work something out. So I think the dialogue has to expand to other important players who could play an important role, and certainly have enough resources and incentives to participate, and have them get involved into this. Because right now we have the United States, we have the Europeans, Ukraine, and on the one side, and then we have the Russians on the other side. Turkey has voiced an interest in being part of the peace process and offering a forum for discussion for both the Russian and the Ukrainian side. The Arab countries, the Gulf countries, could be important players in this process. And so I think the whole pool should be broadened in order to find some sort of a common ground, while offering assurances to both sides. And it is important that assurances are offered to both sides in order to avoid any failures, because one side is represented, the other side will claim we're not represented, or there are no friendly troops in Ukraine that could look at the picture from a different perspective. And therefore, regardless of what we think is ethically and morally right, it is about ending this war, and it's about stopping people from dying. And I don't mean soldiers, but I also mean civilians, specifically who are in Ukraine. Civilians are suffering without electricity. And so that should be the higher aim. Maybe it is somewhat utilitarian. Maybe it is not fair from a moral or ethical perspective in the long run, but at least it stops the killing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great point, and a great job on answering that billion-dollar question. Also this week, French President Emmanuel Macron, he's saying the EU needs to open its own lines of communications with Vladimir Putin. At this point, I mean, we're at the table somewhat now. I mean, we've seen 2 rounds in Abu Dhabi. We've seen, a big push to kind of move forward on these talks, and using U.S. President Donald Trump to get this done. Is this a good idea, what French President Emmanuel Macron has right now to start the EU discussions with Vladimir Putin?
I'm not sure how much President Macron is driven by his political imperative, because what we have here, essentially, we have the European bloc, which is not monolithic, it's not homogeneous. And so you have different players within the European bloc advocating for different ways forward. And so as long as Europe is not presenting itself as one actor, and you have those internal divisions, President Macron might want to talk to the Russians, and Chancellor Friedrich Merz will say, well, we're not going to talk to the Russians. And so you have this disunity, which undermines credibility. And I think that if Europe is to have a role in this, then it should act as a unified actor. And we have seen that Ursula von der Leyen has been trying to achieve that, but it is very difficult to achieve consensus amongst European countries for a variety of reasons. Because from a realist perspective in international relations, there are still states that are self-interested, and if states like Hungary or Slovakia, if they're benefiting from something, we know that Hungary got an exemption and can't purchase Russian energy resources, then we don't have a kind of a unified European voice. Mm-hmm. And the question is here, and the most important one, what is France going to do? The big so what question. If Emmanuel Macron establishes a direct line with the Kremlin, what is his end state? What does he want to do? Because I don't think that at this stage there is trust between both parties, and the Russians are certainly very distrustful of the Europeans, specifically France and the United Kingdom, not officially part of the European Union. Therefore, I'm not sure what exactly this is going to change. Is it going to aggravate the situation? I don't think so, but I don't see any clear idea of what France wants to achieve by opening this line outside of the kind of the European Union framework.
Yes, that's a good point. And of course, unity in the European Union, having a common foreign and defense policy is something that's going to have to be overcome, but that's going to take some quite time to do so. Marina Miron, a spot-on analysis, as always, a researcher at the Defense Studies Department at King's College London. Thank you so much for joining us. We very much appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And that's all the time we have on this edition of Ukraine This Week. Join us again next week for all the latest from the war in Ukraine. Thanks for watching, and hope to see you then. Goodbye.